Now, I'm joined in the studio by Jeff Rickertt. Do you want to introduce yourself, Jeff?
Well, I think I've been on Workers' Power before, but not for a while. So I'm a retired university worker, but I also have a deep and abiding interest in working class and resistance history. So I do spend a lot of time researching and writing about, and where I get an opportunity, talking about the history of worker struggles and the struggles of the oppressed, particularly in Queensland. That's my main area. I've been doing it for quite a while. So that's why really I thought this program has been so important in terms of workers' rights and talking about worker struggles. But I've always felt it's important to try and provide an historical perspective on the struggles of working people and oppressed groups. So I kind of think that's where I fit in a little bit.
Yeah. If you've been listening for a while, you would know that a couple years ago we had the Brisbane Labour History Association on the show regularly to talk about the history of workers' struggles and what we can learn from them. So it's really good to have you back on the show again, Jeff, to talk about more of this stuff. But this time it's sort of a combination. It's both talking about history and what is currently going on. So the topic you're bringing to us today is Subaltern Heritage. Now, I started reading the article that you wrote about this, but I didn't get quite to the bit where it described what subaltern means. So what do you mean by Subaltern Heritage?
Sure, yeah, it's an unusual expression, I guess, and in fact that article that you referred to doesn't really go into that much. Subaltern Heritage is more or less a phrase that I've coined myself.
Oh, that's fun.
So we can think about it in lots of different ways, but let's start with the word subaltern. It sounds a tricky word, but as a political term, it simply means those social classes and groups that are ruled over, in essence. So the working class, sort of colonised peoples, oppressed groups, all of those sections of society who are ruled over by a ruling class or some kind of elite. So those groups, broadly speaking, can be referred to as subaltern groups. And so the term subaltern heritage refers to the physical legacy, the memory in the landscape left by the existence and the resistance of those groups through history. And there are places and structures that embody the stories of their social existence, or our social existence, effectively, because I'm speaking from a position inside that history, I guess. So there are structures and places that embody the stories of their existence, their social lives, and most importantly, their resistance to their subordination. And so these places and the structures are what I call subaltern heritage. It's the heritage of subaltern groups. Now, I probably should make it clear at this point that this is different from the cultural heritage of colonised peoples.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, it's an important point to make. So the cultural heritage of colonised peoples is the heritage that can be traced to, in the Australian situation, before the British invasion, before colonisation began. So ceremonial sites, for example, or places of regular pre-colonial settlement would be cultural heritage of colonised peoples. Now, some of these places are, of course, both Indigenous heritage and subaltern heritage. So I'm thinking of, for example, Victoria Park or Musgrave Park.
Or Deeping Creek.
Yes, exactly. So these are places that have deep spiritual significance that date back to pre-colonial times for Indigenous people of the area, but they also have been marked by their role in the resistance of colonised peoples. So in those situations, those places are both cultural heritage of Indigenous people and what I'm referring to as Subaltern heritage. So a place or a material structure becomes Subaltern heritage, in my view, when it is marked by the experience of subordination and resistance. That's the kind of defining feature that I'm making around what is Subaltern heritage.
Interesting. Yeah, well, we already talked about some examples of like where Indigenous heritage or cultural heritage and Subaltern heritage crossover, but can you give us some more examples of Subaltern heritage?
Yeah, I think it's the point I want to get across, I suppose, is that this is all around us, but there are more obvious places that can come to mind, such as those places or structures that have been built or adapted by subaltern groups for their own resistance goals. And the obvious sites that come to mind, for example, are trades halls in the labour movement context. Union halls are such places. Now, in Queensland, for example, there is a trades hall in Toowoomba, and there's also one in Ipswich, which have survived. And so they're obvious examples of places that were actually created by the working class for the express purpose of going about the activity of organising and resisting. Unfortunately, Brisbane's two purpose-built trades halls no longer exist. They've both been demolished, so we don't have such sites in Meanjin. But probably one of the most important places in that category is indeed the building that we're sitting in.
I was just thinking that.
The 4ZZZ Studios building was, of course, previously the state home for the Communist Party of Australia, and a very important site for radical political organising and resisting. And so it's still here, and
we're still continuing the tradition of resistance and fighting back.
So that's an example of places that were, in a sense, built for the purpose of resistance. So they're obvious. But if we widen the net, there are many, many examples of places that tell our stories. There are places, for example, where communities came together to create their own cultural and social life. They might be sporting clubs or sporting venues. They might be cultural events, theatres, music halls, and so on and so forth. Davies Park, most listeners would be familiar, I'd say, with Davies Park, an iconic park on the river at West End. Now, that park dates back to the early years of the 20th century, and it was the place, or one of the places, where the working class game of rugby league began in this state. So that's an example of Subaltern heritage. It's a place that's still there. That it's about the history of working class sport, working class recreation, working class culture. Another example is Lefty's Music Hall in Caxton Street was once Baroona Hall, which played a critical role in the flourishing punk scene in the late 1970s. So that's another example of working class culture leaving its mark on the landscape. And there are also, of course, the early working class residential areas. If one travels around particularly the inner city areas of Brisbane, around Petrie Terrace or Paddington, or some of the back streets of West End, you come across these marvellous old working class residential areas. And so they remind us of the way our people once lived. So that too is Subaltern heritage. And of course there are the sites where people gathered together to work in large numbers, and there are many places like that that we can still see in the cityscape today.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I live in Darra, and one of the most striking features of Darra when you're walking through it is there are these giant concrete podiums that, from what I understand, used to have giant conveyor belts running across them, full of what is it called? The chalk, basically.
Yeah.
That took it to a factory or away from a factory, and it's a very cool thing. And it's it's like you're saying, it's part of it's an old part of the way people used to work in the area.
That's right. And the remnants of factories, and even the fully surviving buildings that were once factories, like the soft drink factory at West End is another example, which is now where Coles is at West End. That was a factory. Warehouses down at Tenerife and New Farm, that was one of the major warehousing parts of Brisbane. Many of those buildings have survived and have been turned into quite luxury apartments these days. But that is working class history. That they're inscribed with the stories of labour.
It also makes me think of the Forex factory that's still operating, I believe.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, there are many forms of labour. I mean, we're thinking about the old surviving hospitals. We're thinking about the Queensland Government printery in George Street in the city. These are all places where people gathered together and worked for a wage. So they're all sites that have stories associated with the working class and the struggles of the working class. And of course, there are many places that carry those stories in a hidden way. Because when you think about it, our labour is everywhere. The dead labour of the working class is everywhere. So everywhere we look, there's an old CFMEU adage about we built the city, and broadly speaking, the working class of this city, of this state, of this country, is responsible for the labour that went into everything that's around us.
Yeah,
but
literally everything you see.
Yeah, but often it's hidden. So, for example, the surviving homes, very large homes of the colonial affluent, or even the 20th century wealthy, have a hidden history of labour, because there were a lot of workers, and mostly they were women workers who provided domestic service in those places. So everywhere we look, there's that kind of hidden working heritage as well. But there's also there's the sites where workers and the poor and the colonised were incarcerated and sometimes executed, and we should not forget that. Places like the Windmill on Petrie Terrace, where Indigenous people were executed, or the GPO in Queen Street, or of course Boggo Road, or St Helena Island, where the shearers, the Union shearers, were imprisoned in the 1890s. So these are also sites of subaltern history. And finally, I suppose there are the sites that are inscribed with the stories of specific struggles. King George Square, probably most famously. Over the decades, King George Square has been the site of many episodes and movements of resistance, pushing back against crackdowns on our right to organise, our right to march, our rights of free speech, and so on and so forth. And of course, it continues to play that role today. It's one of the major places where the Palestinian Solidarity Movement mobilises in the city. And so there are places like that which are kind of inscribed with the history of specific struggles. Another one that springs to mind that people may not know about, in George Street there's an old hall that is now used by the Hillsong Church. It's George Street in the city, along that section of George Street where there's lots of legal practices up towards the courts. There's an old hall there, which is now occupied by the Hillsong Church. Now, back in the First World War, that hall played a really important role for anti-conscription meetings. And it's still there. If you manage to get inside and have a look around, there are elements of the original hall still there. And if you go down the side, you can very much see the original walls. So the facade has changed, but the actual building structurally is very much the same. So that's another site that played an important role in the history of resistance to conscription and war in this city. And further afield, if we go out to Barcaldine in Western Queensland, you can actually go to the site of one of the 1891 shearers' camps. It's still there.
Oh.
It's just a remnant, but it's still there. So these places that have associations with the struggles of working class groups and subaltern groups are still there in the landscape all around. And this is subaltern heritage. This is our heritage. And these are markers of our shared past, our common past.
Yeah, so I'm not asking the question, what is subaltern heritage anymore. I feel like I get it now, absolutely. And it's a really interesting concept. It's sort of it's sort of a interesting lens through which to view the world around you, to try and get an understanding of everything you're looking at. But what is the meaning of all this? Why is subaltern heritage important?
That's an important question. It's a good question, and I think there's a few answers to it. A couple of obvious reasons why it's important. One is that these older buildings are often, not always, but often intrinsically interesting and intrinsically beautiful. Not always, but they can be more interesting and more beautiful than the ugly capitalist edifices that end up replacing them. And we all have a right to beauty in our lives and not have to be constantly contaminated by capitalist ugliness. And so there is intrinsic beauty in a lot of heritage. As I say, not all of it, but a lot of it. There is beauty to be found, and it should be preserved and acknowledged for that reason, most obviously. The second obvious reason, I think, is that heritage structures are often still spaces where we can gather and socialise and organise. You mentioned this building, it's a classic example. So they continue to have an important community function. And what often happens is when we lose heritage sites, it's not just the loss of the site, but it's the privatisation of the space where the structure existed. So an obvious example are the two trades halls that I referred to earlier. When they were knocked down, the space where they were, different spaces, but both spaces where they existed, was basically taken up with redevelopments that turned them into large edifices where private corporate activity carried on. They were no longer places where we could organise, where we could gather, where we could socialise, and so on and so forth. So it's for the continuity that these spaces give us that they're important. But there's also, I think, a deeper reason why we should care about heritage. And that is the fundamental point, I think, and this goes back to history more generally. Why take an interest in history? It seems to me that whoever controls the stories of the past controls how the present is understood and how the future is imagined. And that's the reason why so many authoritarian regimes invest so much in obliterating history, in erasing history, and retelling history, because that control of the past allows them to prevent the present as an alternate present, There was never anything different. This is the way it is. This is the way it's always been. So that control of the stories of the past is really, really important. And I think there are two elements to this. One is that by obliterating the past or rewriting it to tell the story from capitalism's perspective, the establishment would like us to believe that their control is absolute. That when we walk through the streets of Brisbane, we walk through a world that they create, a world in which their values and their interests are the universal values and interests. But of course, we know, in reality, that when we walk through the streets, we walk through a world embodying the dead labour of all past generations, a world created by workers and built on the dispossession of the original Indigenous peoples of this country. So our physical heritage can help to constantly remind us of that truth. So that's one element to it. The other important element, I think, is that the loss or masking of the stories associated with subaltern heritage helps to disrupt our present communities of resistance. And I think that's a really important aspect of it. So communities of resistance exist in space, but they also exist in time. When important places are lost to us, a little bit of that history is lost as well. So rather than us adding a new chapter to a book of resistance that's been going on, being written for a long time, and which began with people who are long dead, we can end up in the sense that we're always starting from scratch. Yeah. We're always writing the first chapter of the book, and that can be disempowering.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So that's why history, and specifically the physical reminders of history that are all around us, are important for us to be able to connect to the past stories of resistance. A couple of historians have written about this quite extensively. Laura Jane Smith and Gary Campbell, they're Americans, I think. They call this, they coined a term, progressive nostalgia, which it's an okay term, but I'm not all that comfortable with it. But what they meant by it was, it's a way of signalling how the collective struggles, achievements and defeats and the progressive values of the past can provide affirmation and motivation for the movements of the present. I'd actually see it in even stronger terms. In my view, history and the physical places that remind us of history are essential fuel for the political imagination. Because if you think about it, if there are places that can take us back in time, they remind us of the victories of the past, but they also remind us that how much things have changed. If they've changed in the past because of our actions, they can change now in the present. So in a sense, it liberates our imaginations to think about the possibilities of victory. And that's what these physical places can do. They can remind us of those stories, and they can connect us to that past.
Yeah, it reminds me of the idea of cultural hegemony, which is the idea that in order to build a successful working class liberation movement, you need to build a working class culture, and you need that culture to be everywhere. You need everyone to, understand what it means to resist the ruling class, and to understand how we have been resisting the ruling class for hundreds of years. And a really important part of building a culture, any culture, but including a working class culture, is to have a shared history. And that this is a very important part of that. Being able to walk through Brisbane and look around you and see the working class history that is there, and have that be a story that is told within our culture.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's a good way of understanding what I'm trying to get to. So these cultures, they exist in space. You know, the connectivity between different groups struggling exists across the geography of the landscape, but they also exist in time. They connect us backwards and forwards as well as across geography. And everything that's happened before goes into the creation of that vibrant culture of resistance that you're referring to.
Workers cheer, bosses cower. When you tune in to Workers Power.
We are here talking to Jeff from the Brisbane Labour History Association, and we're talking about Subaltern Heritage, which is really interesting. Before we get to that, though, we do have a couple texts I want to read out. Glenn Wooler texted in saying the Darra Brickworks had a conveyor to and from the river. Yeah, so before the song we were talking about how in Darra there are these big pylons that had a conveyor belt running on them for a factory that is no longer operating. And then Sarah Zhu has texted in saying, I love the idea that everyone has a right to beauty in their lives. We live in a time and place where the rights of the individual or individual corporation over a space far outweigh the rights of communities and the way they also experience those spaces. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. That is such a good point. Now, there is a lot going on. There's a bit going on at the moment with the Queensland government, Jeff, because the LNP is reviewing the Heritage Act. What are they wanting to do?
Yeah, so the Heritage Act is the piece of law that protects or potentially protects heritage in Queensland. And again, there are separate acts that protect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage. That's a separate thing again. But the Heritage Act is designed to potentially protect post-colonial heritage in Queensland. And it was established by the Goss Labor government, the first Labor government after the downfall of the Bjelke-Petersen regime. And of course that came after decades of destruction of heritage, particularly in this city. That act has changed a bit over the years, but it's very much the same. The core principles have remained the same, right? And the LNP government, currently in power, announced earlier this year that it wants to review the Heritage Act, and they released a discussion paper for the public to comment on. That consultation period is now closed, and so I haven't heard anything of late, so presumably they're reviewing all the contributions, the submissions to that discussion paper, and they're making up their mind what they're going to do. But the discussion paper, if we can assume, and we have to assume that reflects the intentions of the government, of the minister responsible, has some fairly alarming proposals in it. And they can be broadly grouped in three categories. First of all, they want to abolish the open nomination process. So under the Act as it stands, any member of the community or any group in the community can nominate a place for heritage listing. Right? And so the way it works is that a person or a group nominates a place, there's a form to fill out, and they have to address a set of criteria. That application goes to the relevant state government department. It processes the application. It does its own research on the site, and then it makes a recommendation to the Heritage Council, which is a body established under the Act for making decisions as to what is placed on the Heritage Register. So the department makes a recommendation based on the submissions made, and then the Heritage Council makes a decision. And the Heritage Council can either accept, reject, or accept with modifications the recommendation from the department. But the point is that anyone can nominate a place. Under the proposals put forward in the discussion paper, that open nomination process would largely be scrapped or seriously curtailed. And they want to replace it with a process in which so-called heritage experts and government bureaucrats would have far more say over what nominations actually proceed to the Heritage Council.
Oh, that does not sound good.
For deliberation and a determination. So that would mean that any individual can still make a submission, but there's no guarantee that it will be sent to the Heritage Council.
It's probably just going to get ignored.
Yeah, that's right. So, and they want to set up certain priority categories for what gets considered by the Heritage Council. So that's the first thing, this abolition of a certain curtailment of the ability of people to have their applications considered. The second thing is around the composition of the Heritage Council itself. So the Heritage Council was set up under the Act to provide representation from different sections of the community, including the trade union movement. The Heritage Act allows for the trade union movement through the Queensland Council of Unions to nominate their representative to the Heritage Council. Under the proposals that came out in the discussion paper, that would be scrapped. There would be no trade union representation on the Heritage Council if they went ahead with that proposal. And this is justified on the basis that they want a council with more so-called heritage expertise. So the fact that working class people and trade unionists don't have expertise in their own heritage, I think should be considered a slap in the face. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that the object of the Act itself would change to place greater emphasis on meeting the needs of the so-called stakeholders in this sector. And
so it's for developers, it sounds like.
Well, yeah. Well, they've singled out two groups in particular: the tourism industry and local government. Now, local government has done some good things over the years in protecting heritage, but it's also done a lot of pretty ordinary things in terms of protecting heritage as well. Same can be said about the tourism industry. And of course, in the case of the tourism industry, their main objective isn't preserving things as a public good. It's preserving things for the purpose of commercialising and commodifying them, right?
Making a profit.
Making a buck out of them. So overall, there would be a shift in orientation away from heritage as a public good towards heritage as an asset to be exploited or commodified. You know, monetising heritage seems to be what this is mostly about. So I think the proposals that were put forward in the discussion paper should sound alarm bells for anyone in this state who care about heritage and its protection. And as I've tried to argue today, I think that should be all of us. There's already, I won't go into this here, but there's already a bias against what I'm describing as subaltern heritage. Even though potentially the Act can protect everything, in the way it's administered and in the kind of expertise that is brought to bear.
Yeah, I'm sure the people in this council don't give much of a toss about subaltern heritage.
Yeah, so it's the grand buildings and the official stories that count for more than the kind of stories that we've been talking about this morning. Nevertheless, the Act as it stands does allow for the protection of the things that would be considered important to us as well. But the point is that if these proposals go ahead, that bias that's already there effectively would become more entrenched if the proposals were enacted. So I think it's something that we should be concerned about.
Absolutely, yes. Sorry, we're running out of time, unfortunately, and I wish we had more time to talk about this, but we have 5 minutes left in our show. So where can listeners find out more?
So my good friend and comrade Howard Gill, who actually was a representative on the Heritage Council a number of years ago, and was booted off it for basically, I think, not towing the line. He and I have written an analysis of the discussion paper, and if people want to go to the Brisbane Labour History Association's website, you can just Google Brisbane Labour History Association website, and when you're there, find your way to the blog page, the BLHA's blog page. On that blog page, you'll find this critique that Howard and I have written of this discussion paper, which goes into the kinds of arguments that I've raised today about the importance of the history that counts particularly to subaltern groups. BLHA website, Brisbane Labour History Association website. The name of our article is The LNP and Queensland Heritage, a fresh start or a new threat. So hopefully that will give people a starting point to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and we'll put links to that on our Facebook and on the 4ZZZ Workers' Power page. Thank you very much. Anything else you want to say?
Well, just my takeaway message, I think, is heritage isn't about grand. It's much more than just grand buildings and official histories. It's the stuff that our old people have given meaning to, and it's all around us. So, in your own street, in your own neighbourhood, where you move around our environment, just be curious about what's there, and you'll probably find that a lot of what's there you can identify with because it's part of our history.
Awesome. All right. Now, we don't have enough time for a scallywag, so the scallywag of the week this week is the LNP for putting our heritage under threat. Even though we usually ban the LNP, but they've gotten a pass again to win the scallywag of the week yet again. All right. Thank you very much for coming on, Jeff. This has been a really fun discussion.